Good afternoon, and welcome to the Tulane University School of Social Work's virtual health spot. My name is Dr. Deirdre Hayes, Professor of Practice at TSSW, and along with me is Dr. Reginald Parquet, a clinical professor here at the School of Social Work, and Carrie Mulder, our Media Outreach Coordinator. Pre-COVID, the Health Spot was a monthly in-person health fair held in front of the School of Social Work. The busiest bus stop in the city is in front of our school. So our illustrious Dean Patrick Bordnick, had the great idea to bring information and services to the individuals who ride the bus and use the corridor to access downtown New Orleans. The partners provided STD testing, dental screenings, and assessments for substance abuse and mental illness. In addition, the Health Spot served to provide information on housing, voting, and multiple services available in the community. Although COVID has interrupted our in-person service delivery, we continue to provide webinars to address current systemic issues facing our community. Today's topic is women's role in the juvenile justice system, featuring Dr. Rosanne Adderley, who will deliver a brief lecture on Frances Joseph-Gaudet, an educator, social worker, and prisoner advocate who has been honored as a saint in the Episcopal Church and is credited as one of the originators of the Juvenile Justice Movement in New Orleans. She will then interview Judge Candice Bates, Chief Judge of Juvenile Court, Teneé Felix, the Chief of the Juvenile Division at the District Attorney's Office, and Heather Kindschy, the lead social worker at Louisiana Center for Children's Rights. She will talk with them about relevant issues in today's juvenile justice system. We want to take this time to celebrate women who work tirelessly to improve the lives of families we serve. We encourage you to continue to address the systemic issues that adversely affect our families on a daily basis. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Laura Rosanne Adderley, Associate Professor of History at Tulane University, to educate us about Frances Gaudet.
Thank you. Thank you to the School of Social Work for having me. I am, as you were just told, I'm an African diaspora historian. I study Black experience in the United States, but also around the hemisphere, and that comes up a little bit in the way Mother Gaudet lived her life. But the hat that I'm wearing here today is in part as a historian, but also as one of two co-coordinators for something called the Frances Gaudet Legacy Project. Frances Joseph-Gaudet is from Mississippi, but lived most of her professional life in New Orleans. And I will talk more about the work that she did here and why I actually am an Episcopalian, but I come to her work very much as a historian. But the two people that I would like to kind of honor and maybe just call one. There's a teeny tiny Episcopal Church archives that's run by volunteers in New Orleans. And all praises to them, because Harriet Merle was the retired woman who took on being a volunteer archivist. And she's actually the person that went to the National Episcopal Church and said, we have this African-American woman in New Orleans who did revolutionary justice-seeking things. And she's underappreciated. And unlike the formal Roman Catholic process that involves the Vatican, within the North American Episcopal Church, you can individually advocate to say that this person has lived such a holy life that they should be recognized in the book of holy men and holy women. And my late friend, Harriet Merle, who took on this, like she was she ran the archives on the side when she was retired. It was the thing she wanted to do. But she says, I'm gonna go to those national conventions and put Mrs. Gaudet's name through the process. And it wasn't until after she passed away that we realized that it was almost her single-handedly. We thought, well, this woman's career was so important. She had an independent school. She helped found the juvenile. People knew about her, but Harriet really re-educated people in the 90s about her. And I want to talk about her because what I tell people today, I'm suspecting that many of you who are attending will have at least heard of Michelle Alexander and her work, The New Jim Crow, which is this a pioneering book that kind of exposed the way the overuse of the criminal justice system had created a mostly Black and certainly overwhelmingly non-white underclass of people who had been incarcerated, had been charged with crimes, and were either actually locked up or disadvantaged in every step of their lives because of that encounter with the criminal justice system. When Michelle Alexander's book came out, those of us in the Frances Gaudet Legacy Project, we were like, Frances Joseph-Gaudet was many things, but she was very much Michelle Alexander before Michelle Alexander. And one of our goals with the Legacy Project and with this event for, around Women's History Month is to raise her profile as someone that we can all, particularly who do this kind of work, can look to. And I joke with friends who are psychologists and social workers and lawyers in the city of New Orleans. I said, all of y'all should have her picture in your office, like an icon, all right, to remember what she accomplished. So for those of you, what I've been charged to do before we get into a bigger conversation with all of our panelists is for those of you who aren't lucky enough to know Mother Gaudet, and my father, rest his soul, would always say, you are so spoiled. They pay you to sit around and read books about interesting Black people. That's amazing. And they call that work. Mrs. Gaudet lived between 1861 and 1934. Since most of us are actually having a normal work day, according to the United Nations, March the 25th is the Global Day of Remembrance for the victims of Atlantic slave trade and slavery. All right, none of us got the day off. And it's important to recognize this is a girl who was born into slavery in Mississippi in 1861, and she died in 1934. And I bring that up as a part of her biography for two reasons. One, to remember sort of how close slavery and segregation are to the system that we have inherited, but also when we look at the challenges that we face today and some of the things we're going to talk about in conversation, that this was someone who was born in slavery and knew all kinds of adults who'd been enslaved as adults, but yet and still she essentially had the wherewithal, the get up and go, the determination, the belief in change to essentially do the kinds of things that she did. So anytime we're kind of facing something that seems almost unfixable, uncorrectable, that is, I think we can look to some of the things that she did. The other two things about this time period, that this is often referred to as the lowest period in race relations in the United States, the decades of her life, particularly the period between 1890 and 1930, it's the highest rate of lynching in this country. It's the point at which there was a moment after the Civil War, when in Reconstruction, there were some attempts to advance rights for African Americans. And then, especially within the South, in places where we sit now, essentially white supremacist governments who called themselves that, essentially overthrew that all and said, let's get the Black people back in their place. And this is to be a white dominated society. And that's what it's going to be. And if you break those rules, we can kill you. So in that context, she said about the work that she said about. The other thing that's also worth remembering is that economically, Louisiana and Mississippi, not doing so great in that time period, hadn't yet figured out, we certainly didn't have this tourist economy. And so who is essentially Frances Gaudet? Born in Mississippi, and she moves to New Orleans as a child. For a lot of reasons, a lot of people were coming from Mississippi, from rural parts of Louisiana into cities where they felt there might be more opportunity and greater safety. In her case, it was definitely both. One of the things motivating their move, her uncle had killed a white man in a dispute over land, all right? And the Gaudet family feared that being related to that uncle who had challenged this white man in this way, that put the whole family at risk. That, at a time when being the sort of Black people that stepped out of your place could get you in deadly trouble, that arson and murder were regular reminders. So in her life in New Orleans, she's raised by her grandparents and she has a pretty safe upbringing. She was able to attend Straight College, which was the predecessor to Dillard University. But as an adult, she she had two experiences that really shaped her. One is, and she, like a lot of people that don't put their business in the street, she doesn't write in great detail about it. Her first marriage, we're pretty confident involved both alcohol abuse and domestic violence. And she becomes a big advocate for temperance and reducing the amount of drinking and the abuse of alcohol in working class and African-American communities generally. The second thing, and the thing for which she is most well known and what sort of brings her to prominence in our thinking, is as an adult, and this is, as I said, it is in the early 1900s. All right. She looks around New Orleans and sees a city in which so many Black children, particularly those who face poverty or whose families are facing other kinds of challenge, had precious little help from either government agencies or religious agencies. All right. So she says neither nonprofits nor the government is being particularly well held. And what is most striking, and I think, I'm not sure if everybody can see the chat, you can see her autobiography. The way she writes about these things looks so identical to things we still hear today. She says, visiting prisons, she found too many young Black people, mostly Black, some white, who were either wrongly charged or charged with something way more severe than what they may have done, and that some number of them hadn't in fact committed any crime at all. And no matter how young they were treated as people destined to be discarded by society. She is writing that in the 1910s. All right. So this is what's wrong with New Orleans. We need to do something about this. We haven't moved fast. There's a woman, there's the Dr. Violet Bryan, who is retired from Xavier University as a African-American cultural studies scholar, has an article about her. And also there's a literature scholar, Dr. Shanta Haywood, who refers to her as essentially a prophet. All right. And one of the things to remember is that her own family has lived through these struggles. So she makes a name for herself and gets famous essentially around the courts. We have advocates certainly in this audience and on this panel that she's the kind of person who would become known at the then equivalent of Tulane and Broad. All right, that she was the person trying to essentially, I can teach prisoners, I can teach them Christianity, I can teach them to read, I can teach them the Bible. If their families aren't able to do it, I can get them some extra food because, as you know, like these things were not guaranteed to be as terrible as our jail conditions are, you know, whatever food or resources, I can try to hunt down some legal help if their families don't have that kind of wherewithal. So she essentially, that's how she makes a name for herself here. And she becomes a part of a community of activists that are the first to propose that we have a separate juvenile court system. In the Frances Gaudet Legacy Project, one of the things we are trying to do is actually research more to be clear about precisely the steps and which, you know, how advocates and government agencies work together to achieve that. And I hope we can talk a little bit about that kind of work. The other thing that she does, and the thing for which she is most famous, and she's looking around trying to think, how can I make impact, is she founds a school. For those of you who are familiar with the geography, where the 610 cuts through Gentilly, there is a right where all the sort of interstate ramps are kind of a mess. And there's now sort of a strip mall type building. That was land that she owned. And she raised the money for that in part by traveling around the country, but she also traveled to Europe to raise money for this school. And what was the Colored Industrial School and Home? It was based in part on principles similar to Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute. And I don't want to get distracted by Washington because he's often sort of portrayed as kind of the Black conservative who wanted African Americans to just keep their place and learn trades. And then, you know, white people would learn to stop killing them and denying them civil rights. His legacy is more complicated. And she recognized the saving promise of education. And what is often forgotten about most of these schools, all right, what is often forgotten about most of these schools is they taught what we would consider classical kind of K through 12 basic education, literacy, numeracy, music, cultural awareness. There's wonderful papers that the most fun thing I've ever found was this big argument about precisely what kinds of music should be okay for kids to listen to in their after hours. All right, this again, it's the 1910s. So she founds the Gaudet School, and her goal was to try to offer education to as many disadvantaged young people as she could. In some cases, this school would be viewed by us as sort of a diversionary school, but in fact, what it became was an educational opportunity that all kinds of Black families took advantage of, whether their young people had encountered the criminal justice system or not, because the opportunity for education in that era for African Americans was extremely limited. The school, what happens to Mrs. Gaudet is in the 20s, she realized she's losing her sight. And now we fully understand that an unsighted person could continue their leadership roles in their own enterprises. But she didn't believe that was possible in the 20s. And she ultimately moves to Chicago and to live with relatives, and she dies in Chicago in 1934. The school, she gives it to the Episcopal Church in the hopes that they would continue the legacy. And they actually maintained the school into the 60s until the time of school integration. More important than school history, and I said, please pay attention to the Legacy Project. I can answer more questions about it. My sort of co-conspirator in that is Nell Bolton, who used to work for Episcopal Community Services, but now is an independent contractor in both peace building and justice building work. But there's a letter from someone in Haiti that writes to Mrs. Gaudet and said, my goodness, you know, I look at all the problems of children in poverty all over the world, particularly children of color. We in Haiti are so impressed with what you're doing in New Orleans. We've taken up a little collection and sent money to your work. What I would like us to do and talk about today is think about the kind of vision she had, that if we could just partner the right combination of education, social services, and proper legal response, that we could actually transform the lives of particularly children of color in this city. And she did it essentially as a nonprofit, begging money all over the world. And I said, you know, I will try to see if I can post in the chat. There's Dr. Brian from Xavier has a nice short kind of highlight article about her, since I don't expect people to remember every word that I've said. But I think she's a good foundation to talk about, as we want to do today, paths forward. So I think someone other than me can put us into our mode where I can have a conversation with our panel.
Thank you, Dr. Adelie. That was so informative. And it just amazes me that so many of us do not know that the beginning of juvenile justice reform in New Orleans is credited to a Black woman. Yeah. And so I just really appreciate that information. And so we will now move to the next portion of our program that includes phenomenal women who are working, and the struggle is real, and they're working every day to move forward the work of Frances Gaudet. So I introduce to you Judge Candice Bates, who is the Chief Judge at Juvenile Court, Teneé Felix, who is the new Chief of Juvenile Services at the District Attorney's Office, and Heather Kindschy, who is the lead social worker at Louisiana Center for Children's Rights. And we will have hopefully a really good conversation with some ideas about how to move forward on this issue, which we know is really relevant in today's time. Thank you.
You know, I'm so thrilled to have, this is really the perfect panel. And when I was in graduate school, we had this one woman, Dr. Farah, she'd always ask you, if you could bring someone back to life, what would you bring them back to life for? And this is the conversation that Frances Joseph-Gaudet lives for. In many ways, the Louisiana Center for Children's Rights builds the kind of network that we suspect existed around her. That she, and not because she was the center of it, but the kind of clearinghouse for a certain package of concerns that they in effect were doing it without a structure or a nonprofit to do it. But what I have done, I have questions that are directed to the individual panelists, but please feel free to jump in sort of to all of you, so that, and we will have time at the end for other questions. But I wanted to start with Judge Candice Bates-Anderson about, in part because the world of the juvenile court is in many ways the thing that motivated Mrs. Gaudet. And as much as many of the things that she said sound familiar to us, I wonder that she started off her work in part because essentially she saw young men going through the court system for these trivial offenses and coming out in worse shape, like, less able to have the kind of good lives. And I wondered, Judge Anderson, if you could highlight one thing that you see at juvenile court that would give you a Gaudet moment, like, we have to stop doing this thing. What would that be? Because most of us now, now that we're a city of cars and we all mind our own business, people don't kind of see the justice system, I think, in the way that they did in earlier eras. And what would be your Gaudet moment? Like, gosh, people, you really need to see what I see, and this is not right.
Okay, hi, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity. First, I just want to say thank you so much to Tulane University. As Dr. Hayes is very well aware, my grandmother started off her career as a professor of the School of Social Work. So this is certainly coming back full circle. So I'm so proud to be here. Whew, I have so many Gaudet moments. I guess one of them would be, most importantly, is that the schools have to figure out a way to allow the children access to education without having them subsequently get involved in the criminal justice system. We see too often that kids are having school-related issues, and now that we're doing virtual, and a lot of these kids are obviously on by Zoom, that's a whole nother host of issues. But even before then, seeing the kids that would come in based on just policies or procedures that were put in place by schools that would automatically require resulting to police action, actually having the police in the schools, where it became less of an educational opportunity and more of a criminalization effort. And very often we would see those kids that would come in, and I know there are two people on the panel who would attest to this, where the teachers or the social workers or the counselors felt like we already know what's going on with these children. We already know that they've got a specialized need. We already know there's an IEP in place. We already know that there's something that may trigger this child that we can work on. But unfortunately, our policies dictate that we have to do something different. And then more often when those kids do come in, either A, those counselors have moved on and they're at another school once the district attorney gets to the point of actually getting that case petitioned. So even getting people to come back in to even move forward with the hearing takes a lot of time. Very often we find that the schools were did not really want to have to get police involvement, but their policies and their board and how their rules were written stated that they had to. And so they would come in not interested in pursuing these matters. So you would have a lot of therapeutic services and people that wanted to work together, but then already we've made it a crime. We've criminalized the child. We've already implemented that trauma. We've already shown them that, well, we may believe that you need some help and we may believe that you need some assistance, but first let me put you in the criminal justice system to do so. And I think that if we stop that process and we start looking at really ways to help our kids, that I would see far less of them. And then we would have time to focus on, some of the more serious cases that come in front of us, instead of some of the ones that we really should be able to resolve with just a lot of good work, effort, working together, collaboration, doing models, assessments, looking at what educational opportunities they have, and stop criminalizing these kids when they come through the educational system.
No, I say I love that as an answer, because sometimes I feel slightly compromised about hailing Mother Gaudet for her work in helping to found a juvenile justice system, because obviously kids shouldn't be in the adult system. But in fact, what you highlight there is having them in a criminal justice system at all is not, it's we need something else, some other thing. Some other, I think people are well practiced at sending people into the criminal justice system.
Right.
But
what's the solution of how to stop that process? And I do, and certainly you've certainly educated so many of us today, and just to know that somebody, almost 110 years ago, talking about the same issues that we're talking about today, that makes me feel like we've got a lot of work to really get moving on. I say that I've been here 10 years and I'm talking about the same thing. I can only imagine that we're still dealing with some of the same issues 100 years later, and some of the same things that are plaguing our city. So I'm excited that you've certainly opened up this line of communication.
I wanted to, on a related point, and in some ways sort of thinking about how we move forward, I wanted to ask Teneé Felix a question, which maybe her job is part of the answer. We're stuck with this system in the interim. if I could wave a wand and create the thing in between youth and the criminal justice system that is state funded, well funded, and obvious to everybody. You are a lawyer. Essentially you've practiced in that role. You're now in this sort of role. What is the most effective thing that lawyers can do in this system? Because I think, we have an adversarial system, and I think we kind of understand how that works for adults and, where it's, but I think the rest of us looking in, since kids are going to come into that system, they're going to essentially need legal assistance. It's one of the things that Gladey was doing. If you were going to kind of essentially be the advocate for, like, this is how a lawyer what the most useful things that lawyers can actually do for kids in the system that we have now, until we get, until that it's truly transformed. What is the most effective thing they can do?
Right. So like you said, right, this is an adversarial system. And so when you talk about, what lawyers can do, right, there's lawyers on both sides here, right? We have the lawyers that are defending the children, but then you also have the lawyers who are prosecuting the children. And so I was a defense attorney for a very, very long time. And I can tell you that, as a defense attorney, the goal was always to get the child out of the system as quickly as possible. We recognize, or as a defense attorney, we sort of recognized that just being in the juvenile justice system causes a certain level of trauma to the child. And so, that's sort of where the focus was. And the prosecution, they're more focused on sort of like victims and community safety, and, whereas the defense is only focused mostly on the child. I can tell you now, being a lawyer on the prosecution side, of course, we want to make sure that our communities are going to be safe, right? But we can't, as my boss likes to say, we can't incarcerate our way to safety. I think that the most important thing from the prosecution side as an attorney is to make sure that we are holding the children accountable in ways that they're going to grow, in ways that they're going to learn. And I think, to Judge Anderson's point, we need to start working towards not criminalizing children for what is normative adolescent behavior. And so to that end, here in this new administration, we are working towards diverting as many children as we can from the juvenile justice system, because while we can be holding children accountable, we need to make sure that we are also holding the adults accountable in children's lives when we know that children are struggling. And so I think one of the most important things that lawyers can be doing for children that come through the criminal justice system is getting them out of it as quickly as possible.
Okay, because that's one of the reasons I asked the question, was precisely because there's two sets of lawyers here, and we're gonna have the system we have, a version of it, for 5 to 10 years. I believe, I tell my 19th century historian, slavery ended. Revolution happens. To turn to Heather Kindschy, I said, and I romanticized the Louisiana Center for Children's Rights is in many ways a Gaudet-like entity, a thing she would have dreamed. I wonder, though, is that in terms of, as you look at, she founded a nonprofit, and in fact, this is what she did. She was active in the Temperance Movement, and she was, in many ways, an NGO advocate and participant that many of us would recognize, whether it be temperance, whether it be the kind of, loosely organized folks who were advocating for juvenile court. Then she founded her own entity, which was a school that had a lot of church funding. I was wondering, from your perspective, while we hope that the Louisiana Center for Children's Rights lives forever, can you give us some perspective? Mother Gaudet was doing the things she did because there was no state help. Like, there was no agency, even the poorly functioning agencies we have now, the underfunded resources. She had no choice. All right, it was going to be NGOs, or it was not going to get done for the most part. I wonder what your perspective is on that in terms of, like, in your work. Boy, these are things we should not be doing. like this and I about what is the role of NGOs here? I know that sometimes, you know, what is the case where the NGO really needs to shake its fist at the state and be like, you need to do this. And I was wondering your perspective on that.
That's a really interesting question. I think that what we always talk about a lot at Louisiana Center for Children's Rights is that like we would love to put ourselves out of business someday. We'd like to make it so that we don't exist anymore and that there's no need for us to be around to do the advocacy, because either there's not a juvenile justice system or like not in its current iteration, so that, you know, it doesn't require having us come in and advocate at all these different points. And I think like we're doing a lot, I think especially even recently with like the court being much more concerned about looking at things like being trauma informed. And obviously the new district attorney administration is just like, it's a whole new world for us, like just even trying to wrap our heads around like having people who we can partner with in the way that now we can sort of work together in a way that we couldn't have anticipated before. But I do think that there are like there obviously always should be a role for some kind of government entities. I think that like one of the reasons that LCCR exists the way it is right now as a nonprofit and like not just directly a government entity is that like we just have the ability, like Mother Gaudet, to do our own fundraising, to like get money in different ways and not have to rely sort of on like little bit of like government funding the way some government agencies, like places like Department of Child and Family Services come to mind that everyone is talking about. Like they're so underfunded, they don't have resources, and sort of using it as an excuse of like why things don't work very well. I think like we are fortunate enough to be able to have, as an NGO, have like these alternative ways of raising money and being well resourced so that like we can do a really good job and like not blame it on not having a lot of resources.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, because I was going to say, no, I like that, because it's one of the things that I think Mother Gaudet was thinking about, because she was very clear in her own writing that like the government was failing. But at the same time, I certainly personally, I believe that there's always room for advocates and trying to, and the nimble fundraising thing, it's a debate. I also teach public history, and my students end up, they're very socialist and government controlling because they don't trust any private entity. I know that many people will be familiar with the Whitney Plantation and Slavery Museum. And the only reason that happened is because Mr. Cummings has an inordinate amount of money. And he will say that I have these incredible resources and I can transform a thing and transform a narrative just because, and there's a kind of nimbleness. And the work of government it's messy, it's underfunded. And even if we get it better funded, trying to figure out what, you know, sort of, I'm not sure I want LCCR entirely out of business, because people outside of government will always have a different kind of voice. I do want to sort of drag us a little in two versions of questions for Judge Anderson and Teneé Felix. For Judge Anderson, I wondered, and this is something that haunts us at the project, what is it that we now know about young people that essentially Gaudet did not know? She could see injustice and mistreatment, but what is it that we know about young people today, but are still getting wrong? Meaning we know we shouldn't be doing this because young people, like what is it, if you could educate people better about the kinds of things we know about youth behavior, about development, and that people are still turning up in your courtroom or talking about these young people in ways that are like, wait, we've known for 25 years that that's the reason this is happening. Because Mrs. Gaudet didn't have that kind of advantage. She just knew that it seemed that kids were being treated unfairly.
Right. Well, I think one thing we know is that kids are absolutely being treated unfairly. So I don't even think it's a question. I think it's now something that we know with certainty. I think that also what she wouldn't be aware of is that it would be generational. So it would be generational systematic racism and trauma, and that some of these kids that we're seeing today are from 3 and 4 generations of the same type of treatment. Either their parents or caregivers have been incarcerated, have been in the system. They are being raised by grandparents who are also dealing with the trauma of whatever they've lost with their own child, as well as poverty. You know, she had the benefit of having an opportunity to have a business or a job that created an ability for her to take care of herself and own property. Systematically, people of color do not own where they live. Systematically, they are relying very heavily on the government. I believe at that time, the government probably did not provide some of the services that are provided, but almost where it's become a crutch. And so I think what we know about young people today, and something that we know about, is that first off, they are children, that they think like children, that when they commit some of these crimes that we're reading about, they are taking them from a perspective of a child, not realizing that this is real life and that these are real actions. A lot of them are dealing from a point of where if they have are lacking basic necessities, you know, some of them not attending school, some of them not having a hot meal, some of them not having the right placement, not having activities to be involved in, not having a recreational spot. We've got peak hours where we know these kids are committing some of the acts, some of our biggest times. 3 to 11 is one of our biggest time zones of where we know kids are in trouble. We know that we need to provide outside resources, mentorships, opportunities. Those are probably a lot of the things that she may have had the things to think about, but, you know, let's face it, in 1934, you know, the world looked a lot different. And so I think that we know that these kids really have minds that are molded, and that if we mold them in the right direction, if we, I love what Ms. Felix said, Teneé Felix said about diversion, and what Heather also said about the collaboration that we're seeing. The collaboration that we've seen starting in January has been enormous. I don't even realize we even thought that this was possible, and that we even thought that we could be where we are today, in terms of all of us trying to say, hey, let's not duplicate these resources. What do you have? What do we have? What do we think is a better path? You know, talking about having meetings where the defense lawyers and the social workers and the state all meet to talk about a case, to present it to a judge. And that way we all come together, because as the elected official, I don't know everything. I don't know some of the circumstances that Ms. Kindschy may know about that child, some of the background. I don't know what the prosecutor may know about some of the facts and circumstances about the case. But if we all collaborate together, then we really develop a plan that allows this child to be a success. Because like I tell people, when they want to call me up, or they want to go on the news, or they want to come into a hearing, because these are crimes of violence, but these are children, and they have an opportunity to do better. They have an opportunity to have a second chance. And no matter what happens, no matter how it looks, a child can only be in this system if they are tried as a child until the age of 21. That is the most time we got. So do we fix them? Do we give them a chance that we can give them an education? I talked to you all about this, a state ID, basic necessities that our kids do not have to have the opportunity to succeed. If I don't have an ID, if I've been criminalized, I'm in the criminal justice system, if I have a record, if I don't have an education, if I'm 17 and I'm still in the 8th grade, I am already being set behind before I even got a chance to get out the gate. And I think what we're realizing is that by working together, we can create a more holistic environment where we have some success stories, because we really do. And unfortunately, a lot of what we hear about are the stories that don't work out so well, but we have a lot of kids who get out of this system and do great things and make better decisions. And we just have to give them an opportunity to be kids, not bring them in here. Some of the things these kids come in here for, if that had been happening when I was a teenager, almost everybody I know would have a criminal record. You know, some of the kids that are coming in here for things that are really out of their control. I think that the DA has a policy now where we're not necessarily going to throw things at the wall and see what sticks, actually really trying to make sure that the kids are petitioned that fit the actual crimes, because then it becomes a hard job for the judge, right? You give me all these facts, we got all these circumstances that are put out in the community, but when it all comes down to it, the story that's being told is very different. And had we started putting some services in place and giving them some opportunities and second chances, then we would give them a better opportunity for positive outcomes. And we don't see the family. You know, that's a whole nother story, that we are getting generational kids and then kids in the same family. So there's something going on that we need to address. If we're seeing the older brother, then the younger brother, then the younger sister, there's something that we have to address. And that's, I think, what we're trying to figure out. How do we benefit the entire family?
You know, I want to pick that up in a couple of minutes because I do want to talk about families and in a more holistic way. But to that excellent list of things that we now know, I wanted to ask Ms. Felix. I steered certain kinds of systemic questions to Judge Bates-Anderson and certain kinds of law questions to you. My first introduction to the Louisiana Center for Children's Rights was around advocacy to try to get rid of the juvenile death penalty, actually to state the law. Let's pretend, Ms. Felix, that you can brainwash the city council or brainwash the state legislature. What actually can we do with the law? Gladey had no law on her side. There was no law that mandated almost anything, or at least nothing good. And in fact, the law mandated a good deal of bad, as does our law now, that, you know, essentially requires a certain kind of response to a certain kind of action. Is there a law or laws? Like, Lord, if I could have a state statute that mandated a response, what would it be? Like, you know, let's say that, you know, I tell my students at Tulane, I said, I want to run the university for 3 hours and I'll just put in a bunch of policies, right? You know, if you could, you know, right now the law essentially mandates a lot of consequences. What would you use the law to mandate? You know what? Here's what you should have a law mandating, either city or statewide.
So I think it's not a secret to anyone that I am a huge advocate for treating children like children. If I could have a law that everybody had to follow, it would be that, you know, if a child needed to be prosecuted, then it could only happen in juvenile court, right? And even then, there would be sort of no charge that a judge could not ultimately decide to release a child on once they are found to be rehabilitated. So the way that the laws are right now, there are certain times where it is out of the prosecutor's hands in terms of where that child gets prosecuted, right? Like the child has to be prosecuted in adult court. And what we know now, and probably what we knew, you know, back then, is that children are different from adults, right? Children are, you know, given the nature of adolescent brain development, everything that we've learned over the last several years, or all of the things that we are now admitting to, right, over the last several years, is that we know that young people who commit crimes or who commit offenses are less culpable than an adult who commits the exact same offense, right? We know that children can reason, right? Children know right from wrong. Adults love to say, well, that kid knew right from wrong, you know, when they committed that offense, but it's more than that, right? It's more than just a child knowing right from wrong. It's their ability to make decisions when they are in emotionally charged moments, emotionally charged situations, right? We know that children tend to offend in groups. We know that, you know, children tend to basically, you know, not think of consequences when they commit offenses, right? That's what makes them uniquely different from adults. But the other thing that we know is that children have a huge capacity for change. And so since we know that, we shouldn't be throwing our children away in the adult system, period. So I would love a blanket law that treats children like children across the board, hold them accountable, absolutely 100% hold them accountable, but hold them accountable in ways that we are not throwing them away, in ways that they are going to grow, they're going to learn from, because that's how we are going to get stronger and safer communities.
Mm-hmm. No, I like it. And one of the things in teaching modern African-American history, you teach a lot about about how African-Americans came to believe, you know, in the law. One of my heroes, Justice Adelie Higginbotham, that he said he would tell a story. He was a federal judge, and they said, I want to say he passed away in the late 80s. I'm gonna get it wrong. But, you know, if a Democrat had been in the White House at the right moment, he's the kind of judge that would have been a Supreme Court nominee. And he said, you know, when he was among the earliest Black students to go to Purdue, one of the things was actually said to them, they had the Black students housed in a place, and it was poorly heated. And an administrator actually said to them, the law requires that I admit you here. The law does not require that I keep you comfortable in any way. And, you know, I believe in the law as a certain kind of stick. I did, though, want to return to something, Heather, with something that Judge Bates-Anderson brought up. Louisiana Center for Children's Rights, I love it as a marketing name. People like children. We treat children poorly, but children are very saleable as advocacy. All right. You know, we're all coming up on Give NOLA. And for those of you who hang out in the nonprofit world, you know, we all know what that means. We're scrambling around about like kind of pitch our little thing or our big thing. And is there an advocacy, like from your experience, you know, in social work and in the other things you've done, not just at Louisiana Center for Children's Rights, is there a way to get stronger public and a wider spectrum of support for the kind of things that Judge Anderson is pointing to for families? Like, you know, even I think some people don't like, whose views may diverge from those of LCCR. But they do understand, they have a sense, like advocating for children's rights makes sense for them. Whereas I've been reading this winter, Virginia Eubanks, who's a sociologist, has a wonderful book called Automating Inequality, and how we just blame the poor, punish the poor. And, you know, I wonder as an advocate, if you see strategies for getting us to a society that is more willing to stop shaking their fist at, you know, at poor adults. And recognizing that, you know, families with disadvantage create a whole series of problems. All right. And I just wonder, as an advocate, what you see as that path, because we're a society that's still pretty hard on people.
Yeah. I was recently in a conversation with a bunch of people, and we were talking about like what kids that I work with, what do they need? How do we like meet their needs? And I was like, they need the exact same things that like any other kid that you know needs. Like, we don't have to reinvent the types of things that these children need. They want music, they want sports, they want all of the same things that like kids the world over want to do. And I think like what we need to do is just figure out how to get those same things that kids who go to Newman or Trinity, like that's the same things that these kids want. We just need to figure out how to get them for them. The other thing that I think that we need to remember, and I think that where there could be more resources, are just for supports with parents. A lot of what Judge Anderson said really resonated. That, you know, I think that all parts of the system know that people know how to get kids into the system. Like, they call the police because they don't know who else to call. There's something wrong and they don't know who else to call. And, you know, they call the police respond anytime, day or night, and like they do a thing. And so for parents, I wish like parents knew that they had more resources, but I also wish that there was this other thing that they could call and that could respond and provide a resource besides a police officer that like doesn't also have like a social work background and doesn't really have anything to do other than arrest the child and bring them to court. And like, you know, they bring them to Judge Anderson and like she's limited to the things that she can do because of like her role as a judge, and Teneé is limited of things that she could do because of her role. So if we had these other resources like of a place that could respond all the time, I wonder if that could do something for our kids. I remember, I always say this to students, and it's funny that Dr. Parquet is also on the panel right now, but I remember Dr. Parquet saying when I took his class many years ago that like, there are people in the community that are going to be there on the street corner all of the time, and they are probably not the social workers. The social workers are normally going to be there from this time to this time. Usually the people who are there all the time that are not related to the kids, like may have other intentions for like what that kid is going to do and may be able to get them involved in other things. And until there is like the social worker is willing to be there all of the time also, it's really hard to compete with that. And it makes it much easier for them to say, here, come with me. I'm going to show you this way to do things. And it may be something that is like really taking advantage of that child.
No, I have to say, I love that. And what you just said about part of the reason, because I mean, I hang out in a lot of activist circles and they're like, please do not call the police for this thing and the next thing. But you're right, that people, a huge variety of people call police, not because they are punitive or quote unquote pro-police, but because there is a 24-hour response. And in fact, it is a mandated response. And it's almost for almost nothing else except dire health emergency with 911. There's almost nothing else in this society that we say is important enough to say, if you have a problem, call this number. We're like, the services for families, it's almost like calling 311. It's like, good luck with that. And if we could transform a system, I had a couple of, before we turn to, questions from the wider audience, I did wonder if any of y'all wanted to comment on better ways we could be responding to substance abuse. Because the part of Gaudet's, one of Mother Gaudet's work at the time, which was the response that they thought was correct at the time, she was a huge temperance advocate. As soon as they let us go anywhere, one of my, the Frances Gaudet Legacy projects is to go up to actually the Women's Christian Temperance Union has an archives up in Chicago. And she was very well respected. It's a mostly white women-led organization. Most of them had come out of situations in which it was mostly alcohol at the time, had destructive consequences in their own families. But they very much they were excited to have an African-American working class woman amongst them. But, the temperance movement, for those of you that haven't studied it, and I've only studied it a tiny bit, was very judgmental, and it was very abstinence is the way, and very punitive, and you're gonna turn to Jesus and never have a sip of wine ever again kind of thing. And I think that Mrs. Gaudet ultimately devoted more of her energies to the education and justice reforms, but we all know that the substance abuse both problem and its response, she knew that too. And I said, we don't like her temperance response, because it doesn't work. But I was wondering if you all could comment on what you see as kind of, particularly the new face of a different version of substance abuse as to what Mrs. Gaudet was up against, and also what might be the most productive responses to it.
Oh, thank you. I would love to comment. First off, I think that the first thing we have to do is we have to realize that obviously substance abuse is a disease, right? That these kids are not choosing to abuse drugs. And so a lot of times there's something else that's going on. They're not saying, oh, I'm going to go hang out and do this because, I want to disobey or break the law. I mean, a lot of times it's a sickness. And so unless we treat them, if we treat a child as if they had a disease, cancer, if they had sickle cell or something, that's the same way we should first off treat substance abuse. We have certainly do not feel that it's in a child's best interest to have it punitive, because again, if we're saying that you are sick and you have a disease, but we're going to punish you for doing it, then what message do we send? I think part of the problem that we all found is that in the participation in drug court, which can be offered here at the court, was that it was more punitive than if a kid just pled and said, okay, if I just say that I did have marijuana or that I did use marijuana, then I would get a far lesser sentence. And so really being trauma informed, but also making sure that we put the kid in services where it's not overkill as well. Because we can't say we want a child to participate in a program, but then the expectation is they come to this program several times a week, they have to miss school. And then again, it's a pointing of the finger, you did something wrong. So how do we bring these kids in where they realize that we really are understanding that a lot of them that are using certain drugs are using it as a scapegoat. They're using it because they're dealing with other issues. We'll have them come in. I even had one child where it was so difficult and the district attorney kept wanting us to, part of his plea agreement was that, he had to refrain from the use of drugs. And he kept using drugs, but he also had suffered a very serious injury in which it was determined that his use of marijuana was actually therapeutic to him based on the type of injury that he had sustained. Oh, I apologize. Based on the injury that he had sustained. So then we get into how do we not penalize these kids for something that we already know is wrong with them. And I think that part of it is us all working together. I think it comes in with the social workers. giving us that information, knowing that this kid is actually suffering or struggling, also looking at ways of, if those cases are petitioned for type of offenses, that the district attorney has a chance to divert that and say, okay, if you participate in some type of 12-step program, or if you receive some type of services, or if you even have somebody to talk to about it. We've also dealing with the fact that a lot of this is being legalized on the, not on the state level, but being legalized on certain levels. So some of the kids are saying, well, wait a minute, it's legal on one end and it's not legal on another. So also education and educating the kids and educating ourselves, but certainly looking at it as a way of not punishing the kids for what they're doing, but talking to them, letting them talk with their own peers. You know, we're starting teen court again, where you're being judged by your own peers. You're talking about it like, hey man, that can lead to a gateway drug to something else. Or you start doing this and can affect that. And really just educating the kids about what's out there, what options they have, and how we don't bring them further into the system by their use of drugs or alcohol.
I don't know if other folks had thoughts before I hit you. Ms. Felix, you looked like you were about to say something.
I was just, just to piggyback off of what Judge Anderson said, we know that there is, specifically speaking towards the children here in New Orleans, that a lot of them suffer from an immense amount of trauma, right? We know that because there was a study that was done that said that gave us the statistics. And so we know that, trauma a lot of times leads to substance abuse. And so one of the focuses of this administration is trying to get to the root causes of what is, making children do things, right? And to Judge Anderson's point, right? We don't want to be punishing children if they are suffering from trauma or they're, using drugs as a result of some trauma that they suffered. They need help, right? That's the way that we're going to keep them from coming in through the juvenile justice system. And so those are the exact types of cases, the cases where we know that children, have been in possession of drugs, or that they're committing thefts so that they can get money to go and buy drugs. Like, those are the cases where we need to dig deeper, where we need to figure out what the root cause is, where we need to make sure that we're doing, trauma assessments through Children's Bureau, who apparently has a lot of money to be able to assess these children. We want to make sure that we're getting to the root causes, because otherwise, sure, we can give them treatment for substance abuse, but they'll be right back, right? They're going to continue to use substances and abuse substances if we're not getting to the root causes. And so, that is going to be a huge focus in this administration when we are diverting kids, that we're diverting them to the right problems that is going to address the root causes that is causing them to sort of act out.
Dr. Adderley, I just wanted to add to that, just for the social workers in the audience, that everything that they're saying is totally true, but there are also no real substance use programs for kids in the community. So there are they're at least not treatment programs. I think most of what exists are educational programs. There is one inpatient program in the state, 1.5, that we can refer our clients to, but for the most part, there's no one, once we identify that this is an issue, there's nowhere even really for them to go. And that is primarily a result of the fact that how this is funded through the state government is not doing enough to make it worthwhile for entities to even be able to provide this. There used to be a couple of different places. I've been doing this for almost 9 years. When I first started, there were several places where kids could get outpatient treatment for it. And over the years, they have sort of gone away because the reimbursement was so low that I think they just couldn't even make it work as a financial model. So I think if we're thinking back to Dr. Mother Gaudet's legacy and trying to figure out how to change things, I think we need to be looking at solutions to things like how programs for poor people are funded, and that they are worthy and deserving of really high quality services the same as anyone else. And right now, they're just not able to access that. And I think that's across the board. That's substance use, that's trauma-informed therapies. There are very, very, very few if you're a Medicaid recipient.
No, I'm so glad that you brought in the Medicaid at the end, because when all of y'all were speaking, what was occurring to me is I have a fancy job for a wealthy private employer. And what that means, especially now in these remote times, is if they I mean, don't get me wrong, my health insurance is garbage because US health insurance is garbage, but they keep reminding me, like, here are ways you can access services. You know, here are ways you can access counseling services. If you have a small medical question, here's a way that you might be able to access it. Like the paperwork is Byzantine and it's over expensive, but as an upper middle class person working for a wealthy private employer, somebody is tripping over themselves to make sure that I'm aware of all the paths that all this money and paperwork can get me next to either counseling or medical care that I might need. All right, it costs an insane amount of money. But whereas if you are a Medicaid recipient or outside what is pretty, you know, as I said, it's expensive and paperwork oriented, you are at a super disadvantage, at an extreme disadvantage for any. And what you said about the substance abuse services, that's just shocking because I do want to leave time for questions for the audience because I did actually have some questions about kind of race and poverty, because often people forget that while these problems disproportionately affect youth of color, it's not like Louisiana is going to win any prizes for how they treat any poor youth or any poor families. I did want to, before we turn to audience questions, so give each of you an opportunity to answer what I think is my favorite question about Mother Gaudet. And she eventually made a decision. I'm going to make a school. All right. That was the decision she made. She was a part of a network that helped create what became a public juvenile court system. But in her own case, she said, institutionally, the single best and most productive institution I can create is a school. When I look at the population that I'm trying to serve, and the school actually literally started out of her house. We are, God willing, thanks to the Newcomb Institute at Tulane, by the end of this year, we should have, like, online all of the images that we have. We have digital interns working on that stuff for us. But that was the decision she made. I'm going to essentially make a school. I wondered for each of you, if you were going to make your own institutional solution, all right, that I'm going to found a thing, all right, what would the thing be? All right, because she, you know, and she didn't have an illusion that her school was going to solve all of the things she was concerned with, but she did make a very specific decision that what she would found was a school aimed at, it was essentially, excuse me, kind of a high school. It was kind of an 8 through, kind of a serving the 12 through 18-year-old crowd. What would you do? And it's a question, like if you had to say, you know what, I got some unlimited resources, I'm going to write a grant for this institution, what would it be?
Okay, I can go. So I know I would create a community care center. And that community care center would be I would think that we need one in 2 different zip codes. We need one in the Central City area, and we need one in New Orleans East. And that community care center would also be what's considered a one-stop shop. It could be in any of our old school buildings that are not currently being utilized, any benefactor in the city that has a building that is dilapidated, in which the funding would be to recreate that space where they would have classroom settings, where they would also have a recreational facility. They would also have a computer lab and a podcast room. They would also have an ability where it would only be open to kids. They would have to be between the ages of about 8 and 17. They could come in if they needed to do online learning. They would have the opportunity to get access to a state ID. They would also have access for the parents to do the paperwork so they could get a birth certificate and a card, Medicare, Medicaid card. They would also have a station that would be set up with housing. So if they needed to apply for, there was a problem with housing through HUD, they could fill out that paperwork. There would also be a setup where they could take advantage of all of the NOLA Works projects that are in New Orleans through the Office of Youth and Family Services, which is the Summer Success, Pathways to Success. They would have access to someone with the school who would be able to give them their records. Our kids are pushed out because everywhere they go, they need certain basic necessities. Everywhere they go, they need a state ID, they need a birth certificate, They need a copy of their school records or reports or transcripts. That has been so difficult. Everybody on this line can tell you how hard that is and how many of our kids cannot get into. So even if they do have a bed available at some unknown facility for a child, if we don't have all that paperwork, they're left out. It would also give them an opportunity to enroll in school. So often they come out of the system and they've never been in the system. They've never been enrolled in school because grandmother doesn't have the paperwork. So it'd be a one-stop shop where they could go, no, I'm not getting arrested. Nobody's gonna be checking my name for warrants. They're not gonna be checking my grandmother to make sure she's got her. And it also would allow for the grandparents who have been taking care of the kids to have access to get a custody card. And so it would just be a shop that would be not only therapeutic, a center where they could go in and enjoy everything else that all the other kids enjoy, access to games, video games, a light meal, but also be able to get the basic necessities so they can get out in the community and to be a success. Can't get into Nord Camp without all that paperwork. You can't get into any program or anything without having some of the basic requirements that so many of our children don't have. So you know why they don't do it? Because they didn't have that little piece of paper that allowed them access. You give the kids access and you give them an opportunity, you give them a place for growth and where they feel good about who they are, we won't be seeing them again. I can promise you that. So that would be my one wish.
I like it.
I don't think I could come up with anything better than that. The only thing I would just echo what Judge Anderson said, but I would want more than 2, Judge. They would have to be in every neighborhood.
I was going to say, imagine to Heather's earlier point about the police, what I had in my mind, if they are pilots, if you know how to say, is there a police station in this neighborhood? Or is there a hospital? Is there a community care center here? Like, where is it? Like, if we could normalize that, and it's not some kind of special service, it's a thing that someone's been running around, Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, they said, where do you mark the beginning of progress in civilization? And I don't know if people know this. I love the internet for this. She said, the first time I see a human with a healed fracture. And they were like, what? And she's like, look, in ancient times, like, early civilizations, if someone broke their leg, you couldn't hang around to look after them. You had predators, you were living outdoors. They developed an organized way to sit with someone with a broken leg until the leg got better. When the society starts caring for the people with greatest need, that's what progress looks like. Heather, I don't know, we have room for plenty fantasy institutions.
Well, the thing that I would add to Judge Anderson and Teneé's plan is I think that we need to be rethinking this idea of policing. And I know it's a popular thing for people to be talking about, but as a former school social worker and as someone who sees this a lot, and like I talked about earlier, I think often parents want to know that they can call someone for help and that the help is going to come. And there are some sort of versions of this that exist. There's a mental health crisis line, but like other things, there are often lots of barriers in preventing them to respond to certain cases for certain reasons. And so I think figuring out a way to have a more robust response. And I don't exactly know what that looks like, but if you can call 24 hours a day and have a police officer respond, that there needs to be an army of social workers that are separate and apart from the police that could respond to different types of emergencies in our society and be able to help those families, because poverty is an emergency in a lot of cases with the families that we're working with. Just the things that pop up are different all the time.
This is a great conversation, and I'm not sure who is managing the questions, but there is one that stood out to me that I want to get to. Sort of for those of you in the audience, please do put questions in the Q&A. There is one that I wanted to start with that any of you can answer. Someone wrote and they said, one of the things, and I think you can all see it, one of the things that the panel shows, each of you from very different experience, says that there is a high level of consensus among people who know, all right, of the kinds of reforms that are urgently required. What is it that policymakers don't get? Like it's, and it is it is. And now that we have all this communication, so if we now have so much consensus, why is this so intractable?
Okay, I've gone first quite a bit. I was going to see if somebody else wanted to go. Okay, first off, the policymakers, you have to stop having an executive person over the policy, a sub person over the policy. So if you've got 4 or 5 people that are getting paid on writing the policy before the money trickles down to the program, then there's no money left for the program. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we have to develop policy that it cannot be in direct conflict with another policy that might be out there. So that's where collaboration and communication and education is important, because I may know a policy that works really well for on the juvenile side, but that may be a policy that's in direct contrast to perhaps a policy that's of the district attorney's office or a policy of LCCR. So I think we're trying to work through a lot of the red tape with those things. And then if you don't like the law, and what we've discovered over here at Orleans Parish Juvenile Court, and you don't like what some of the law requires, then you create policy as a judges in en banc, and you sit in en banc and you say, well, we believe that a policy should be in place, and that if it provides that you are allowed to charge fines and fees to children that come through juvenile court, then we create a policy where we say that here, the judges of Orleans Parish Juvenile Court will no longer charge fines and fees. So sometimes we got to step out of the box and create our own policy if we feel it's in, and then you just have to figure out how those outcomes work. So sometimes you get challenged and you have other courts of law that get to decide those decisions. But you have to be willing to step out on faith and out on belief to start creating some policies that we think are better. Because again, we all write policies to kind of close off one another, but until we write those policies to be more holistic to the kids that we serve, I think we're seeing a huge, I'm very excited about 2021. I've said that often. I feel it's a year of collaboration, of great change. I feel like all the agencies are really trying to figure out how to work together, not only the defense district attorney, but also OJJ, as well as DCFS, and a lot of people that we're partnering with. But again, we're only here for a short time, right? So our work here, while we've got to create the laws that follow that and the policies that can withstand change. Because if I'm not here and a new judge comes in and says, well, I don't really like that policy, I'm going to change it. That's where the legislators and the laws have to be rewritten. I know that Ms. Felix had talked a little bit about the power that the judges have or the power that other persons have. I don't even have the power to say that there's certain types of crimes that come in front of me. And I feel that a child, they've done certain things in secure placement or they've done certain things in non-secure placement. There's still some old laws on the books that still give the law to the person who no longer is even in that elected position. So we've got to educate ourselves on what policies really benefit the kids and work towards reaching out to those people. Write this differently, look at it differently, and introduce different legislation that can make a change so that we can adopt policies that subsequently equate into laws that make a difference for these children.
I would just add one thing, Dr. Adderley, that and I think that Judge Anderson sort of said this at the beginning, but I think really needs to be emphasized, that there's a lot of people who end up doing they're writing a grant so that they can do case management. They're writing a grant to do, we just hear this over and over again. Here's a new program that's going to case manage these kids. And those of us who have been doing this for a while, we're we literally don't have any practitioners to be referring these kids to. What we need are the people who are where the rubber hits the road. We need trauma therapists. We need people to be doing direct service. And I think that is a place where money and resources and things need to go, instead of focusing on these things that require administrative, and we're just going to help give you resources. Well, another thing that Dr. Parquet used to say is that a social worker is someone who is distributing resources to other people. If you are working in an area where there are no resources, it's much, much more difficult to do your job. So I think that if we could get those policy makers to focus on this idea that the direct service is where the focus needs to go, our kids and families would be a lot better off.
And so just to add, from a legal perspective, when we're talking about, sure, we all sort of have the ultimate goal here of getting best outcomes from children and treating children like children. And we can, like Judge Anderson said, there's some things that we can change internally, or some things that we can change in our offices or in our space, or even in New Orleans, how we do things, right? Like we have this policy now where we're not going to transfer children to adult court if we get to decide not to transfer children to adult court, right? But that won't help the children who live in Baton Rouge, and that won't help the children who live in other parishes, right? And so it's all about, like Judge Anderson said, finding that person who's going to step out on faith, who is going to actually change the law through the legislature, where a larger amount of children are ultimately going to be affected, right? Like, so the legislature has to change the laws in order for it to reach more children. Right now, all we can do is collaborate amongst ourselves to help, this certain little subset of kids that are coming through Orleans Parish. But, it would help if we had more leaders outside of Orleans who are willing to step out on faith, treat kids like kids, and create legislation that is going to impact sort of a wider scope of children.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Mulder. I'm going to jump in and help facilitate the questions that are in our Q&A and in our chat to make sure that we can get those in the last couple of minutes that we have in this panel. So this one is for you specifically, Judge Anderson. It's how do you reduce trauma as much as possible in your position on a daily basis, being that you, as a judge, you would be sentencing children. So what are you doing in that regard?
Okay, thank you for the question. So I guess the first way we try to reduce trauma on a daily basis is we are now offering in this pandemic times is that the children are allowed to appear by court via Zoom. So what that means is that while I may be in the courtroom, because we know the minute they touch that door, right, that's already traumatic. We already know that the moment they have to come in through security, they have to give their name, they have to be wand to make sure they don't have any weapons and all those good things, that's trauma. So already I think that we're starting to stop that in the sense of having them come in via Zoom. Sometimes they're a little bit too comfortable, but they're in their own environment. We get to see their successes. We get to see kids that come in and they're holding up their certificates of where they've done something good. We get to have a caregiver that's on the line. We get to have another caregiver that wants to have some input, also receive that Zoom call. So they get a lot more support. Okay, so that's the first thing, offering them support. Also, I think what we're doing is that by screening the cases and that the DA screening the cases and really trying to meet is that we're saying, well, initially, as soon as that kid comes in, perhaps they would be eligible for teen court. Teen court's been in operation for a couple of years. We weren't getting any kids that were being taken in. Already in the last couple of months, many kids have been accepted into teen court. DA is signing off on those. So that's a court where they come in, they're judged by their own peers. That reduces the greater risk of trauma. We're doing assessments. So we're doing assessments that if we feel that a child has already come in, we have Miss Brianna Rock, I believe she's on the line, who does some of those, and I don't want to get into assessments because again, I'm just a judge, so I'm not going to overstep my lane, but I know they're the tier 1 and tier 2, but we're actually doing assessments to see how those kids are affected. We're making referrals for community-based programs, not just programs. I know that Heather had spoken about, we've got a lot of managers, but, do we have where the rubber meets the road, where there are actually programs that we're making referrals to, where the kids are actually doing something positive. We've got Mellow, even though kids have already reached the court, they're already involved in something positive. We have Grow, which they're already doing something that is positive, that is bringing in something where the child feels good about them. So when they do come in for that initial appearance to answer, they do come in initially with me, they're able to tick off all the good things, because that's what I remind them, that maybe they have done something, or maybe there's a reason why they are here, but tell me what's good is going on in your life. Tell me what accomplishments you've had. And I think by starting it off that way, we try to get some information in terms of, what grade are you in? What do you like to do? Do you have an ID? Those are kind of the basic questions I start to ask. Do you have a plan for the summer? So immediately when they come in, we have the opportunity, if they are coming into the judicial system, to offer them some of the programs that exist through the city's Summer Success and Positive Pathways. But all they're thinking of is, oh, the judge thinks that even though I'm in here, I might be somebody that's good for a job. I might be somebody that's good to work in this program. So just trying to give them some positive reinforcement, but also trying to see what the trauma is, where it lies, but not also making a huge record of it. Because if I start and then the mom starts ticking off all the things that's wrong with the kid, the grandma, what does that do to them, right? So trying to keep it that even though you're here, you're just a child, you made a mistake, You deserve a second chance. And really, I don't even know if you made a mistake anyway, because the district attorney first has to prove the case. So just remembering and trying to keep them and being interested in what they do, in talking to them like they are people that I respect. And I also want to know what's going on with them, but also making them mindful that they have to be accountable for what happened or what may have happened, but also giving them an opportunity to have a voice. I think giving kids a voice really reduces some of the stress and the trauma that they may feel, and that I'm trying to listen.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that. This is a question that was sent to me in a private chat. It's how can treatment providers, and I'm assuming in mental health treatment, behavioral health treatment, how can treatment providers achieve better outcomes within the current system? Heather, this may be something that's kind of in your area. I'm going to kick it to you first.
Yeah, so I think like for mental health treatment providers, the number one thing that I wish people that social workers and counselors were doing would be to be seeking out continuing education for trauma-informed treatment, and then being able to do that with their kids, that they could do EMDR or they could do TFCBT, that they're like doing these trauma-informed modalities with our kids, because they may not need or want to be in ongoing long-term therapy over the rest of their lives. What they need is for someone to like solve some simple problems, probably process some trauma with them, but like the trauma services are just not available. The other thing, I just wish that the other thing that service providers did like more generally, like pro-social activity type service providers, is that like they reviewed what their processes are for like bringing kids in and what barriers may exist. Again, this has been touched on several times in this panel, but you know, you have to have all this documentation, you have to have all, and people assume that like it's an easy thing to do, to like have a birth certificate if one exists in the world for you somewhere, or just because you have a social security card that theoretically exists because you have a social security number, doesn't mean you physically have that card. And like Judge Anderson was saying earlier, if you don't have access to those actual documents, that makes it so you can't get all of these other things that you need to have to be able to show that you can be in this program. It's hard to access your school records. It's hard to access a lot of things. So what I wish that service providers would do was just see if they are trying to find a way to say no or trying to find a way to say yes. And I wish that they could more figure out how to work with kids who might not be able to get those things, to kind of get them in anyway, and to understand that kids that may not have those documents probably need those services even more than those kids who can get those documents.
Heather, thank you. Anything else to add on that from service provider perspective?
Yeah, I would just agree with what Heather was saying. I would also say that if you are a service provider, highlight the good things that the kids are doing. Far too often I get the reports and I understand, and I'm certainly not in this field, but again, the judge not only wants to know what's wrong, but I want to know what's right, because there is a lot more that's going right in that kid's life, and maybe just highlighting that when there are reports that have to be provided to the court, and being mindful of things that may have been a situation between the service provider and the parent or guardian, because they're feeling a sense of trust. And they may divulge or disclose some things that, and obviously both everybody else on the panel understands how sometimes those documents can be used in a bad way, in terms of I don't need to know too much. And I think I would certainly agree with, maybe helping these families figure out a way of keeping a document list, whether it be teaching them how to create folders on their phones. All these kids have phones. A lot of their parents have access to phones, or just give them a takeaway that they leave with everything you make a copy of to provide them access to a program. Make a copy for themselves. Have that report follow them. Have those documents, because they will need them more often than not. And they will need them in other areas and other avenues. And to have access to it is so important. I make part of the court record. Goodness knows I shouldn't do that, but at least I know we've got a centralized location where everybody can get access to the things that they may need. And again, if you come into me for the documents, we're doing something wrong.
I see Dr. Hayes and Parquet have joined us. I think we're coming up on time. And so I think I'll turn it over to Dr. Parquet and Dr. Hayes and Dr. Adelie. Thank you all so much. I'm going to give you all the parting thoughts to sort of close us out here.
Wow, this has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. And I'm almost saddened that it's going to end right now. I want to give much thanks to Dr. Adelie for facilitating this discussion and for providing the historical context for Mother Gaudet and her important work. Heather, look, it is so good to see you again. And I got to tell you, you represent our profession extremely well. Teneé, we look for great things from you in your new role as the chief of the Juvenile Division. And I certainly want you to know that we at the Tulane School of Social Work are very willing to assist you and your work in any way that we can. And certainly thanks to the Honorable Candice Bates-Anderson, who's serving as the chief judge here in Orleans Parish for juvenile. Judge Anderson, you probably don't know this, but I grew up with Bobby Bates in Holly Grove. And I spent many days playing basketball in his backyard. In fact, Bobby was the only yard that had a basketball goal. So we enjoyed those experiences with him. I just want to make a couple of closing comments. And Dr. Adelie, you kind of set the foundation for this. The importance of education and how Mother Gaudet found it necessary to, start her own school. We know from the literature that the more educated a young person is, the less likely that he or she will engage in juvenile or delinquent crimes and activities. And it was Horace Mann who many years ago said that the great equalizer, that education is the great equalizer of the conditions of men. Now, to be fair, we know that his statement was only partially true, particularly when it was applied to Black people. But the point he was making that education makes a huge difference in the lives of young people who are at risk. We know that. And the more educated a young person is, the less likely that he or she will engage in delinquent activities. So we have to strengthen the school systems. We know for a fact that outside of the home, the church and the school is really the first social service system that our kids come into contact with. And if they are manifesting behavioral issues in the classroom, it's more than likely those things are stemming from home. So we have to do some, not labeling, but do some early identification work to assist those children in the work in their homes. We're talking about legislation. When I was the superintendent of LTI in Baton Rouge, which was the largest juvenile facility in the state, my biggest adversaries were state legislators. They believed more in retribution than in rehabilitation. And we have to change that paradigm. I mean, it's still true today. I would like to see more and more persons in the helping profession, social workers, et cetera, to run for these municipal and state legislative offices. I think we can do a better job. There's no doubt in my mind about that. And if you all will remember, Sidney Bartholomew was the only social worker who was elected mayor in the city of New Orleans. A lot of folks don't know that. So listen, I just want to thank each of you for joining us today, particularly to all of our participants. And we look forward to hearing and seeing you in our future health spots. You all will be receiving a survey. We want you to complete that survey. And in that survey, please indicate the other types of subjects that you want to hear about. Now, my last statement will be this, and I've been accused by my male students of being sexist, but I believe to my core that as we celebrate, Women's Month, I really believe this to my core, that women are the most important and the most powerful people in the world. We don't have time for me to tell you why, but I hope you let that sink in for a bit. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you, guys. This was beautiful. I love it. It will be on YouTube. It will be posted. So we will send you the link so that you can send it to others who will benefit from it. And for social workers, your certificates will come out after you answer the questionnaire, after you answer the evaluation. Thank you very much. I appreciate you guys, and we will do this again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.